Lexus GX470 secondary air injection pump, diverter valve, and check valve replacement. I'm Brian Eslick from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps of replacing those. We're going to get started by removing the top engine cover by removing the 2 bolts and lifting the cover straight up and out. On the passenger side, we're going to remove the panel by removing the clips at the front and the rear of the panel, and then we'll lift the panel straight up and pull out. Next, we're going to remove the air snorkel by loosening the 2 clamps, and then we're going to remove the squeeze clamp here. After getting the clamps loose, you pull the vacuum line off here, wiggle the snorkel off the air box and off the throttle body. And also, if you worried about vacuum line routing, there's a sticker that shows you how all the vacuum lines route on the vehicle. There will also be a vacuum line at the front of the airbox that you'll need to remove. Next, we're going to remove the throttle body by removing the 4 bolts, and we'll slide the throttle body off and leave everything connected. To make quick work of this job, I'm going to be using my Milwaukee M12 cordless ratchet. It's a 3/8 drive. This thing will save you a ton of time. I'll leave a link in the description of the video. That way, if you guys want to check that out or pick one up, you can. Once you get it unbolted, you'll just pull it straight off and leave, like I said, leave everything connected. Now we're going to unplug the 3 vacuum ports here at the front of the manifold. Now you got the 3 vacuum ports disconnected. We're going to remove the 2 bolts that hold the vacuum switch manifold down and the purge valve bolts and push the wiring harness aside. With the vacuum switches unbolted, you'll just flip it over and out of your way. I will remove the bracket at the back of the manifold by removing the 2 10mm bolts, and the purge valve will start pushing off to the side. Back on the passenger side, on the wiring harness, there's going to be a couple 10mm bolts that's bolted to the fuel rail. We'll remove those and push the wiring harness aside and unbolt the ground strap here. Now that the wiring harness is unbolted from the fuel rail, we're going to start unplugging the injectors by squeezing the tabs and pulling off. And we're going to work our way down the fuel rail and unplug all 4. Also, after unplugging the injectors, there's a couple sensors in the front we want to unplug to get as much slack in the harness. Also, just under the vacuum switch is a cam sensor that we'll need to unplug. And it's right here. You'll squeeze the tab and pull it straight out towards you. Now that you got everything unplugged from the passenger side of the intake, you're going to start pushing the wiring harness as far back as you possibly can. Now we're going to move over to the driver's side and we're going to unbolt the ground strap here on the bracket. And then we're going to start unplugging the sensors and fuel injectors at the front here, and then start working your way back and unplug all 4 fuel injectors on this side and start pushing the wiring harness over. Now that you got the injectors unplugged, when you push the wiring harness back, you'll see the cam sensor here in the middle. You'll unplug it just like you did the opposite side. At the back of the intake, there's going to be an electrical connector that you're going to unbolt and also unplug. On the 2 heater hoses in the back, there's going to be a little catch to hold them together. You're going to pop that off. That way you can maneuver the hoses around. Now we're going to remove the cover on the driver's side here by removing the clips and pulling the cover off. Now that the cover is off, we're going to remove the fuel line, the return line here, by pulling this little plastic cover off and setting it aside. Next, we're going to squeeze the little blue tab on the left and the right side of it and pull upwards and disconnect it like this. Now we're going to disconnect the main fuel line by grabbing the orange clip and pulling straight up. And once you hear it click, then you'll squeeze the tabs on the sides and pull off. Now on the very back of the manifold, where the plastic wiring harness is, there's a 10mm bolt we need to remove. Now with an 8-inch extension and 12mm socket, we're going to start the front of the manifold and start removing the nuts and bolts. There's going to be 5 on the passenger side and 5 on the driver's side. And these 5 bolts are pretty easy to get to. They're just straight vertical shots. So as you can see them down there, you can see this. They also have a Torx bit on them if you wanted to use that too. And I will use my Milwaukee ratchet to make things go faster. Now the bolts are removed, you're ready to lift the manifold out. So you're going to lift it up in the back and the front, trying to lift equally and lift it out. And then when you get about halfway out, you're going to unplug the vacuum line at the front. As you're pulling the intake manifold out, you also have to guide the fuel line out from underneath the wiring harness. So here is the secondary air injection pump, diverter valve, and the 2 check valves that we will be replacing. So I'm going to install a factory secondary air injection pump and the 2 check valves. I will link these all up in the description of the video, all the parts and tools that I use, so if you need those you can look from there. So this is the diverter valve that we'll be installing, and we're also going to install new gaskets, and I'll link these up too, along with the hoses that we're going to use. There's going to be 2 hoses in the kit, so we're going to the larger one with the elbow, and then a shorter one that mounts to the diverter valve and pump that we'll install too. So we're going to get started by unplugging the electrical connectors for the diverter valve. There's 2 of them, so you unplug those 2, and you're also, while you're in here, you should inspect the wiring. Rodents like to crawl underneath the intake and chew on the wiring in here. So after you inspect the wiring harness, you're going to finish by unplugging the secondary air injection pump. Once you get those unplugged, there's going to be 6 bolts that you can remove, 2 on the diverter valve and 4 on the bracket on the pump, and they're down below here, and there's 1 underneath the pipe. So before I start unbolting anything, what I'm going to do is clean the ports with rags and make sure no debris falls inside. Then I'll stuff a few shop rags in the ports, that way nothing falls inside. Okay, to get to the bolt that's underneath the pipe here for the pump, I'm going to use my magnet and put the socket down in here first, over the nut like this. Then I'll take my extension and slide it down in between the pipe, and I'll connect it to the socket, and then I'll unbolt it. Once the bolt is completely removed, I'll just pull the extension up and the socket will stay in, and I'll use my magnet to retrieve the socket, and then I'll retrieve the bolt with the magnet also, or the nut. Now that I have all the bolts removed, next I need to get this hose out in the back. The easiest way to do that is to make an incision with a knife or a razor blade and cut the hose. And once you get the hose cut, then you can just lift the whole pump and valve out as one whole assembly and set it aside. And now I take a second look at all the wiring harness and make sure that the knock sensors and everything are in good condition. Now we're going to start working on getting the 2 check valves removed, and we're going to unbolt the wiring harness here. There's a 10mm bolt, and that gives us a little more free play in the wiring harness. So we'll get started by unplugging the 2 vacuum lines to the check valves, and then once you get the check valves unplugged, we're going to start getting the bolts on the side unbolted. So I'm going to use an 8-inch extension and go from the side like this. We're working on the driver's side, and you get straight onto the bolts and start backing the 2 bolts out on the side there. Off a 12mm socket, we're going to remove the 12mm bolt right here that holds this metal pipe down, and we're not going to pull it out. We're just going to loosen it so we can move it side to side like this to gain access. Now we're going to take a pry bar and put it on top of the 2 check valves and lightly pry the wiring harness up and back, and then I use a bungee cord to hold the wiring harness and everything out of the way like this, and that holds everything just out of the way so I can see better and look back in there. Now on the passenger side, we're going to take a 10mm socket and a universal swivel and put a little tape around it so it doesn't flop around, and we're going to come from the side like this with about an 8-inch extension, and then you can actually see the bolts here, so you can guide the socket onto place, and you can remove the 2 nuts. So once I get the bolts unbolted, I use my magnet to catch them so nothing falls down below. So taking out these 2 check valves is going to be the hardest part of the whole job. After getting the 2 bolts out of the pipes from the side, next is going to get the 2 bolts that hold the check valve down. And to get to the back one, we're going to need a thin wall socket. So I'll show you. Here is a standard size 10mm socket and ratchet, and then here's a thin wall one that I have made by Snap-on, and it's about half the size, so it'll fit just behind there and crack the bolt free, and then you can spin it off by hand. Once you get the 2 bolts unbolted, then you can just lift the valve straight out, and as you can see, the back bolt wouldn't come all the way out. If you guys are having trouble getting that out, you can also take this crossover pipe off. But if you take this pipe off, you'll also have to order new gaskets for it and coolant. but I'm going to leave the pipe in. So next we're going to remove the 10mm bolts on the other valve here on the side, and we're going to use the extension and come from the side like I showed earlier. So the driver's side's a little easier to get to. You don't need any wobble sockets, just a straight on shot at the two bolts. And then I also like to use the magnet, so once they get them unbolted, I can catch the bolts and pull them out. Okay, now that the pipe is unbolted, what I'm going to do next is take a pry bar and put it over here underneath the pipe a little bit and pry the wiring harness up a little bit and back towards the firewall. That gives me plenty of access to get to the two top bolts on the check valve. I'm going to use the same short socket to get this side off too as I did the other side. And once you get them unbolted, you'll just pull it straight out like that. And as you can see, the bolts stayed in there like this. So the check valves are different between left and right. So this is the driver's side check valve, and this will be the passenger side check valve. So you're going to need some gaskets. These are the gaskets. I'll link these up in the description. There's going to be 4 of them in total, 2 on each check valve. So 2 on the left and 2 on the right. And the gaskets have these little ears that are going to fit around the check valves, so you just push them on like that and they hold them in place. So you install all 4 of them. So now that the gaskets are installed, we're going to take the bolts and put them back through the valve like this, and then slide the valve back into the back here. I'm working on the driver side first, so you want to make sure the bolts are in there before you put them back there, and then you line them up, and then you'll just start. Now that you got the check valve back into place and bolt it back up, what I'm going to do is use my pry bar and pry the wiring harness back a little bit. That way I can get access to the side bolts. And what I'm going to do is put a piece of paper in the socket and then put the bolt in there, and that way you can shake it and it won't come off like this. And then you'll come from the side and start the 2 bolts. Now that you got all the bolts started, you can go ahead and tighten them all 4 down. And you're just going to tighten them down where they're nice and snug. You can kind of feel that little gasket kind of crush down. So you'll tighten it down just enough, and there's not enough room to get any torque wrenches or anything back there, so you just tighten them down by feel. Now that the valve is all secure and tight, we're going to take the pry bar again and put it back on top of the check valve and pry the harness back and use the bungee cord again. Then we'll put the second check valve back in, making sure the bolts are inside the valve. So once you get the 2 main bolts bolted back in, the 2 bolts for the side pipe are a lot easier on the passenger side to get to. You can start them by hand like this, and then you can reach around the bottom one and you can also start it. Now that both check valves are bolted down and secure, the next step is to take the 2 vacuum lines and plug them back in, and the longer one went to the furthest one towards the driver's side, the shorter one to the passenger side. Also, after plugging in the 2 vacuum lines here, we're going to remount the 12mm bolt on the pipe right here and secure it. Now that the vacuum lines are re-secure, we can go ahead and take off our pry bar setup here and remove that, and then we can position the wiring harness back into place and start the 10mm bolt here in the corner. Now we're going to take the vacuum pump, this short hose, and a diverter valve and link them all together like this. Then we'll take the whole assembly and set it inside. I'm going to use the same magnet technique to start the bolt in the corner. Then I'll start all 6 of the other bolts and tighten them all down. And then once we get those all tightened down, we'll start plugging in the electrical connectors for the diverter valve, the 2 switches here, and the vacuum pump right here. And we'll also re-secure the wiring harness connector here back to the pipe. So now I'm going to take the clamps off the old hose and install them onto the new hose with the elbow, and then go ahead and install that onto the pump. You'll have to bend and flex the pipe to get them both on each port, and once you get them on, then you can run the hose clamps down and tighten those up. Now that you got the hoses on, you can double check that you got all your bolts tightened and your electrical connectors connected. And then you can go ahead and remove all the rags. And once you get the rags removed, then you can look down in the ports with a flashlight and double check that no debris has fallen inside. Now we're ready to replace the intake manifold gaskets by just peeling them off and replacing them with new ones. I'll link those up in the description. Now we're ready to lower the intake back into place, but we want to make sure we route the fuel line underneath the wiring harness right here. As we go in, we want to make sure we plug in the vacuum line in the front of the intake manifold also. Then we're going to lower it down into position. Double check that no wiring harness or anything is pinched underneath the gasket. And once we're confident with that, then what we're going to do is install the bolts. And the way I like to do that is take a little piece of paper and stuff it into the socket like this and put the bolt in, and then you can hold the bolt into position, lower it down, and start all the bolts like this. So now you're going to take a torque wrench and a crisscross pattern. You're going to start here, then move over to the other side, and then move back here, then move over here, and torque it down. Then you can move towards the front again and torque it here. And then once you torque that one down, you'll move over to this one, and then you'll move back to the back and torque it here, here, and then move back to the very front and torque it here and here in this pattern, and you'll torque it down at 13 foot-pounds. Now you can reinstall your throttle body, install the 4 bolts and tighten them down. I'm going to start on the passenger side in the back. I'm going to plug in the injectors. So I'll start in the very back and plug that injector in and move my way forward, and then I'll flip the manifold back over and I'll bolt it up, and also I'll plug in all the sensors in the front right. Now I'm going to plug in the ground strap here and tighten that down. Now that the ground strap is plugged in, I'm going to double check my wiring harness real quick, make sure everything's plugged in. Then I'll secure the wiring harness to the fuel rail and then flip the manifold over and tighten those 2 bolts. Next, we're going to plug in the vacuum port here and put the squeeze clamp on. After we get that done, we're going to move over to the air cleaner assembly and put that back in. And we're going to make sure that we get the valves plugged in right here. And then we're going to make sure the vacuum line is plugged in here. And then we'll hook it over the throttle body first. And then as we're going down, we'll hook up the vacuum line here, and then put it back on the air box. After reinstalling the air cleaner, if you have any questions about the vacuum routing, there's a sticker under the hood that you can double check that. Now on the driver's side, we're going to start in the back and work our way forward and plug in all the injectors and everything. First, we're going to start in the very back here and make sure that we put the 10mm bolt that bolted the wiring harness back to the back of the intake on. After getting the back and bolted up, then we can start bolting up the little brackets to hold the wire loom here. Plug those in. Next, you'll make sure that you plug in the rear injector and then start working your way forward, plugging in all 4 injectors on this side. Next, we'll bolt up the secondary air injection and make sure it's all plugged in. Then we'll route the hose onto the front of the manifold here, plug it on, and make sure you put the clamp on. Then we'll put the PCV hose on here. Next, we're going to bolt up the ground strap to the bracket here. And then we're going to bolt up the other ground strap on the front of the cover here. Now we're ready to plug in the fuel lines. So you'll line it up with the port, push it on until you hear it click. Then you'll push the lock tab down until it clicks. And make sure it's really secured. Give it a tug and make sure it doesn't pop back off. And then secure the hose back into its bracket. Now we're going to put the return line back on. And you just put it on the fitting, push it down until you hear it click. And then we'll put on the safety catch. And then once you got that on, you'll give it a nice good tug and make sure it doesn't pop back off. Now we're ready to bolt on the bracket that went across the top of the intake. At this point, we can start the vehicle and double check for any types of leaks or problems. Now we can put on the side cover on the driver's side by putting it on the tabs and putting the clips in. And then on the passenger side, we'll put the cover on by lining up the tabs and putting clips in. Now we're going to put the top engine cover on. We're going to line the plastic hooks. They're going to go over the bracket that we bolted across the intake here. So they'll hook on there like this. And once you hook it on, then you'll rotate the cover down until it lines up with the 2 bolt holes there, and you can bolt it up. And that'll complete the job of replacing the secondary air injection pump, diverter valve, and check valves on a 2007 Lexus GX470. I'm Brian Eslick from How to Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, encourage you to subscribe, and also to remind you that I will be linking up all the parts and tools that I used in the video in the description. So if you need those, you can get those there. Thank you again for watching.